Greece is on the verge of default tonight, hours from what many believe is a near certainty it will miss a Tuesday deadline to pay back more than $1 billion to the International Monetary Fund.
To Greece, a country on the brink of collapse. Banks shuttered, ATMs running out of cash, and now echoes in our country. Vacationing Greeks left stranded here penniless. ABC's Alex Marquardt reports in from Athens on the eve of one of the biggest showdowns in Greek history.
Tonight, a country deeply divided. All week, the banks closed, life savings locked up inside, endless lines at ATMs with withdrawals limited to just $67. If you're lucky enough to find one that still has cash.
The country really has to pull itself together somehow.
Heartbreaking scenes, like this retired man collapsing in tears after failing to get his wife's pension.
In 1981, the country's finances were in good shape and in tandem with the country's liberal welfare policies, wherein Greece had a respectable debt-to-GDP ratio, but the situation dramatically deteriorated over the next 2 decades, mainly due to wasteful and excessive expenditure, which caused the deficits and debt levels to explode. They had a relatively respectable debt-to-GDP ratio of less than 60% and a budget deficit below 3% of GDP, which skyrocketed, peaking at 180% in 2011 because of the contraction of their economy in the aftermath of the crisis. The final nail to the coffin came in 2009, when the newly elected government revealed that the fiscal deficit was 12.7%, more than twice than the previous figures, sending the crisis in a higher gear. The liberalist welfare policies of the New Democratic Party created a bloated, inefficient, protectionist economy. But that growth came at a steep price in the form of rising deficits and a burgeoning debt load. This was exacerbated by the fact that these measures for Greece had already exceeded the limits mandated by the EU's Stability and Growth Pact when it was admitted into the Eurozone. Hence, despite the pact, the Greece government racked up years of debt. For example, Greece's debt-to-GDP ratio was at 103% in 2000, well above the Eurozone's maximum permitted level of 60%. Greece's fiscal deficit as a proportion of GDP was 3.7% in 2000, also above the Eurozone's limit of 3%. So the interest rates on its bonds, which normally rise when a country runs deficits, generally stayed low. The government's borrowing spree helped to pay for public services, public wage increases, and other social spending. Its borrowing was hidden by budget subterfuge. Warnings about its condition went largely unheeded. Everything went bust in 2009. A new government then disclosed that Greece's fiscal deficit was far higher than anyone thought, hitting 15.6% of GDP. In 2011, Greek leaders and their rescuers came up with a 3-year bailout plan in May 2010. The plan imposed tough austerity on the Greek government and its people to reduce the Greek budget deficit. The retrenchment included tax increases, reduced pensions, public sector wage cuts and looser regulations to restore competitiveness and growth. In return, the government got up to €110 billion in loans from European countries and the IMF. The ECB also stepped in to buy Greek bonds in the secondary market. The plan seemed to work at first. Yields on Greek bonds fell. But the fiscal consolidation took an economic toll. Greece's economy sank in early 2012. Greek debt restructuring took place. The government could meet its expenses while continuing budget cuts. In 2013, Greece achieved a small primary fiscal surplus, the fiscal balance excluding interest payments. But again, the medicine made the patient more sick. Greece's economy collapsed. Its economic output declined by 25% from the 2010 level. Wages and pensions fell. Unemployment reached 27%. And the medicine did not even work in reducing Greece's debt-to-GDP ratio, which climbed from 130% of GDP in 2009 to 180% at the end of 2014. unless the Greek government's private borrowing rates remain exceedingly low for decades, or the Greek economy grows faster than expected. Greece's next debt crisis will be just a matter of time.
Greece's debt crisis was the result of 4 mini-crises. First, there was the 2008 recession that shrunk the revenue that Greece received from its taxes, the taxation crisis. Second, there was its inability to access capital markets because it falsified its finances, the corruption crisis. Third, there was its inability to print euros to help repay its loans when taxation and government borrowing were no longer options, the monetary sovereignty crisis. And finally, there was its wasteful government spending, which did little to improve its global competitiveness, the competitiveness crisis. These mini-crises fed on each other to produce the debt crisis that gripped Greece for nearly a decade. The Greek debt crisis was unquestionably a challenging time for Greek citizens. Many were left jobless, economic growth stalled, and income inequality worsened. But the crisis is also a compelling narrative from which we can draw lessons for future governments to follow.
Fiscal policy is the government's use of taxation, public spending, and borrowing to achieve economic objectives, aiming for sustainable growth. It is often compared to monetary policy, regulated by the central bank. Fiscal policy is a crucial aspect of economic management, influencing governments by adjusting taxes, spending, and borrowing. It plays a vital role in controlling inflation, increasing employment, and maintaining the value of money, through 2 variables to influence fiscal policy: taxation and expenditure. Fiscal policy aims to create public assets, promote public health, and stimulate private sectors to grow. It also aims to stabilize the economy during inflationary pressures. In the short term, governments may focus on macroeconomic stabilization by cutting taxes and increasing spending. In the long term, they may focus on sustainable growth and poverty reduction. An effective fiscal policy boosts private investors' confidence, promotes income equality by levying direct taxes on higher-income individuals, and subsidizing consumption items for low-income households. This balances receipts and payments, ensuring a balanced economy. Fiscal policy can be used to influence the economic conditions, such as lowering taxes to stimulate demand and fuel economic growth during a recession. This approach can lead to higher demand, which in turn leads to increased employment and competition for labor. Alternatively, the government can increase spending without corresponding tax increases, such as building more highways. Deficit spending occurs when government expenditures exceed tax receipts, often resulting from a combination of tax cuts and higher spending. Contractionary fiscal policy, on the other hand, involves increasing taxes, reducing public spending, and cutting public sector pay or jobs to restore balance to the economic cycle. This policy is rarely used due to political unpopularity. Public policymakers face different incentives to engage in expansionary or contractionary fiscal policy, and the preferred tool for reining in unsustainable growth is usually a contractionary monetary policy, which involves the Federal Reserve raising interest rates and restraining the supply of money and credit to control inflation. Fiscal policy impacts are not equally felt by everyone, with tax cuts potentially affecting the middle class during economic decline. Government spending decisions can also affect specific groups, with projects like bridges benefiting construction workers and space shuttles benefiting a small, specialized pool, reducing aggregate employment levels. In A Tale of Two Economies, Marthlandia faces inflation from sustained economic growth, while Bougainville grapples with a prolonged recession. The key solution lies in utilizing fiscal policy. Bougainville can employ expansionary measures like increased spending to boost demand and end the recession, while Marthlandia can implement contractionary actions, such as higher taxes, to curb inflation. The lesson underscores how government spending and taxes impact aggregate demand differently, with tools like the tax multiplier guiding effective policy decisions.
To further our understanding of fiscal policy, let us look at the other side of the coin, that is, its successful use. The Indian economy too, for example, was riddled with fiscal instability up until 1991. However, the path of debt-induced growth that was pursued partly contributed to the balance of payments crisis of 1991. Following the crisis of 1991, the government charted out a path of economic liberalization. Tax reforms focused on lowering of rates and broadening of the tax base. There were attempts to curb subsidies and disinvest the government holdings in the public sector industries. While initially the fiscal deficit and public debt were brought under control, the situation again started to deteriorate in the early 2000s. This induced the adoption of fiscal responsibility legislations at the central and state levels. Financial Responsibility and Budgeting Management Act was instituted by the Indian Parliament to uplift fiscal stability, mitigate the fiscal deficit, gain macroeconomic stability, and regulation of public funds by moving ahead toward a balanced budget. Consequently, there were major improvements in the public finances. This probably contributed to the benign macro-fiscal environment of high growth, low deficits and moderate inflation that prevailed around 2008. In 2008, the policymakers had to grapple with the impact of the crisis that was affecting the Indian economy through three channels: risks to the financial sector, the negative impact on exports, and the effect on exchange rates. The government adopted an expansionary fiscal stance to deal with the crisis. It activated a series of stimulus packages towards the end of 2008. This included an overall central excise duty cut of 4%, ramping up additional plan expenditure of about Rs. 200 billion, further state government borrowings for planned expenditure amounting to around Rs. 300 billion, subsidies export-oriented industries. It also expanded the scope of social security schemes under the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, NREGA. Due to effective fiscal policy interventions, the Indian economy weathered the financial crisis rather well. GDP growth declined to 5.8% year-on-year in the second half of 2008-09 compared to 7.8% in the first half. By 2009-10, India's GDP was growing at 8%. This increased to 8.5% in 2010-11. Recent developments indicate that policymakers have come to accept strict budgetary constraints while attempting to maximize resources for developmental activities. Hence, the fiscal policies of the government serve as an integral instrument in achieving their macroeconomic goals and objectives, therefore becoming an important tool and responsibility of the government to serve its people and maintain a healthy economy.